Picture a world where the concept of time isn't locked behind the face of a clock, but instead painted across the sky by the sun's journey, whispered by the wind through fields, or marked by the steady drip of water in a bowl. This was the reality for medieval societies, a world where timekeeping wasn't just a practicality, but an art form, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Without the ticking hands of modern clocks, how did people know when to rise, when to work, when to pray, or when to gather? The answer lies in a symphony of natural cues, human ingenuity, and cultural rituals that transformed the abstract idea of time into something tangible, something alive. Think about your own routine. How often do you glance at your phone or watch to structure your day? Now strip that away. No digital alarms, no schedules buzzing in your pocket. Instead, imagine relying on the first light of dawn to signal the start of labor, or the shadow of a sundial stretching toward evening to tell you it was time to rest. Medieval timekeeping wasn't just about measurement. It was about harmony, aligning human activity with the rhythms of nature, the cycles of the seasons, and the pulse of community life. From monks tracking prayer hours by the stars to merchants coordinating trade routes using candle marks, these methods didn't just keep time, they shaped civilizations, fueled innovations, and connected people across vast distances long before the mechanical clock ever existed. But here's the fascinating part. These ancient systems didn't just fade into obscurity, they laid the foundation for the precise timekeeping we rely on today. The way medieval societies measured time influenced everything from the structure of cities to the rise of global trade networks, even the way we think about productivity and punctuality. So how did they do it? What secrets did they uncover about tracking time without gears or springs? This journey will take us through candle clocks and water clocks, church bells and celestial observations, revealing how humanity's quest to master time changed the world in ways we still feel centuries later. Stick around, because the story of medieval timekeeping is far more than a historical curiosity. It's a testament to human creativity, and it all begins with the simplest question: how do you measure something you can't see? To understand how medieval people experienced time, we have to step outside our modern obsession with precision. Imagine standing in a field at sunrise, no watch on your wrist, no clock tower in sight. The day didn't begin at 7:15 or 8:30. It began when the first streaks of light touched the horizon. Time wasn't something you chased, it was something you felt. The medieval mind didn't slice the day into identical minutes, but into broad, breathing intervals. The cool hush of dawn, the bright heat of midday, the golden lengthening of shadows that signaled evening's approach. These weren't just markers, they were invitations to sow seeds when the earth warmed, to rest when the sun hung high, to gather when the light began to fade. This fluid sense of time was especially visible in the rhythms of rural life. Farmers didn't need numbers to know when to plow or harvest. They read the land itself, the tilt of the sun, the crispness of the air, even the behavior of animals. A rooster's crow wasn't just noise, it was nature's alarm clock, and when winter shortened the days, entire villages adjusted their pace, working fewer hours and conserving resources. Time bent to the seasons, not the other way around. Yet amidst this organic flow, one institution sought to impose order: the medieval church. Monasteries became the heartbeat of structured time, their daily prayer cycles called the divine office, dividing the day into sacred moments. Monks used simple tools like sundials or marked candles to track these intervals, but even their schedules were flexible, shifting slightly with the lengthening and shortening of daylight. The bells that rang from abbey towers didn't just call the faithful to prayer. They wove a shared rhythm into the lives of everyone nearby, from nobles to peasants. Over time, these religious timekeeping practices spilled into the secular world, planting the seeds for later innovations. What's striking is how this blend of natural and structured time shaped society. Markets opened not at a fixed hour, but when the sun reached a certain point in the sky. Travelers estimated journeys not in minutes, but in how long it takes to say a prayer. Even the medieval workday was shockingly adaptable by today's standards. Laborers often took multiple breaks, aligning their rest with the sun's movement rather than a supervisor's whistle. This wasn't laziness, it was wisdom. People understood that fighting against nature's tempo was futile. The contrast to our modern world couldn't be sharper. Today, we live by the tyranny of the clock. Alarms jolt us awake, deadlines loom like storm clouds, and every second is accounted for. But in the Middle Ages, time wasn't a commodity to be spent or wasted. It was a dance, a partnership with the world. That's not to romanticize the era. Life was harder, shorter, and often brutal, but there's something profound in their ability to listen to time rather than command it. As we'll see, this delicate balance between natural rhythms and human ingenuity didn't just keep the Middle Ages running, it set the stage for the very tools that would eventually replace it. The story of medieval timekeeping isn't just about how they measured hours. It's about how they understood their place in the universe. Long before gears and pendulums, the sun dictated the tempo of human life, a celestial conductor orchestrating the rhythms of medieval society. It wasn't just a source of light and warmth, it was a living clock, its arc across the sky dividing the day into visible, tangible segments, the most ingenious adaptation of this natural timekeeper. The sundial, a technology so elegant in its simplicity that it endured for millennia. Medieval craftsmen didn't invent sundials, they inherited them from ancient civilizations, but they refined them with remarkable precision, carving intricate markings into stone or metal and mounting them on church walls, monastery courtyards, and bustling market squares. These weren't just tools, they were public landmarks, gathering spots where communities synchronized their daily routines. For farmers, the sun's position was more than a time indicator, it was an agricultural almanac. They knew that when the morning shadows stretched long and thin, it was time to till the soil. When the sun hovered directly overhead, they paused for a midday meal under the shade of an oak tree. And as the light faded to a golden slant, they drove livestock back to barns, their workday framed not by shifts or quotas but by the earth's own rhythm. Travelers, too, relied on the sun's guidance. Without mile markers or GPS, they estimated journey durations by how much daylight remained, a system so intuitive that medieval route descriptions often read like poetry. Walk from the village until the sun touches the western treetops, then turn where the old willow leans. But sundials had a critical flaw. They demanded sunlight. Cloudy days, especially in northern Europe's unpredictable climates, could render them useless. And as the seasons shifted, so did the length of daylight hours, a problem for societies increasingly reliant on consistent scheduling. Monks, for instance, needed to pray at specific intervals, even in winter's gloom. Merchants required reliable ways to coordinate trade caravans or market openings. The limitations of sun-based timekeeping sparked a fascinating era of innovation, pushing medieval minds to invent supplementary methods. Some turned to the steady drip of water clocks, adapted from ancient designs. Others burned notched candles, watching the wax descend like a slow-motion hourglass. What's remarkable is how these methods coexisted. A monk might check a sundial at dawn, consult a water clock during cloudy afternoons, and light a candle at dusk, each tool compensating for the other's shortcomings. This wasn't chaos, it was adaptability, a testament to human resourcefulness in an era before standardization. The sun remained the ultimate authority, but its imperfections forced societies to think creatively, laying the groundwork for the mechanical clocks that would later revolutionize timekeeping. Yet even with these innovations, the sun's influence never faded. Medieval people understood something we often forget. Time wasn't just a number on a dial. It was the warmth on your face at midday, the lengthening of shadows at eventide, the way the light slanted differently in October than in June. Their relationship with time was visceral, rooted in the world around them, a far cry from our modern abstraction of minutes and seconds. The sundial's legacy isn't just in its shadows, it's in the way it taught humanity to see time as both a force of nature and a canvas for ingenuity. And as we'll soon discover, that canvas was about to get a lot more complex. While the sundial relied on the sun's generosity, water clocks or clepsydry turned to something far more dependable, the steady, unyielding drip of water. Picture a tall vessel with a small hole at its base filled to the brim. As water trickled out, markings along the inside would reveal how much time had passed, like a silent, liquid hourglass. This wasn't just a clever gadget, it was a revolution in timekeeping, allowing medieval societies to measure hours even when the skies turned gray or the night swallowed the sun whole. Monasteries became the guardians of this technology. For monks, prayer wasn't just a daily ritual, it was a rigid schedule, with services like matins at midnight or lauds at dawn requiring precision. Water clocks kept the sacred rhythm alive, their gentle drips counting down the intervals between devotions like a metronome for the soul. Some designs even included floating mechanisms that would trigger bells at set times, turning the device into an early alarm clock. Imagine the echo of that bell cutting through the quiet of a stone chapel, calling the faithful to their knees, not by human judgment, but by the impartial flow of water. But water clocks weren't confined to cloisters. Courts of law embraced them too, where fairness often hinged on measured time. In some places, lawyers were allotted a specific amount of water, and by extension, time to present their cases. Once the vessel emptied, their argument had to cease. This wasn't just practicality, it was poetry in motion, justice measured not by the ticking of a modern clock, but by the relentless drip of a shared resource. Yet for all their ingenuity, water clocks were far from perfect. Changes in temperature could slow or speed up the flow. Mineral deposits clogged the holes. Someone had to refill them constantly, making them high-maintenance companions. And unlike sundials, which required no adjustment across seasons, water clocks needed frequent calibration to stay accurate. But here's what's fascinating. These flaws didn't discourage medieval inventors, they inspired them. Craftsmen tinkered with multiple tanks to stabilize water pressure, added floats to track levels more precisely, and even integrated gears for more complex mechanisms. Each tweak was a step closer to the mechanical clocks that would later dominate the world. What's often overlooked is how these devices shaped the very concept of time. Water clocks didn't just measure hours, they introduced the idea that time could be segmented mechanically, independent of nature's whims. That shift in thinking was monumental. Suddenly, time wasn't just observed, it was controlled, portioned out like grain from a sack. The water clock's legacy isn't just in the drips that marked prayers or trials. It's in the quiet revolution of humans learning to bend time to their will, one drop at a time. Candles did more than push back the darkness, they measured it, one slow, flickering inch at a time. In an era before pocket watches or smartphone alarms, people turned to an ordinary household item and transformed it into something extraordinary, the candle clock. Imagine a tall taper marked with carefully spaced notches, each representing a unit of time. As the flame consumed the wax, each notch would vanish, ticking away the hours like a silent, glowing metronome. Some versions even had metal balls embedded in the wax. When the flame reached them, they'd clatter into a tray below with a satisfying ping, announcing the hour like a makeshift alarm. This wasn't just a clever hack, it was timekeeping democratized. Unlike sundials, which required sunlight, or water clocks, which demanded maintenance, candle clocks were portable, affordable, and usable anywhere, from a king's chamber to a peasant's hut. Take King Alfred the Great, who famously divided his day into equal portions using candle clocks. 8 hours for rest, 8 for work, and 8 for study and prayer. For a ruler juggling wars, laws, and scholarship, these wax timekeepers brought order to chaos, but their impact reached far beyond royalty. Farmers used them to gauge the length of winter nights. Students timed their readings by how many notches burned. Even monasteries, those bastions of punctuality, relied on candle clocks for nighttime prayers when water clocks froze and sundials slept. Yet candle clocks were far from flawless. A drafty room could make the flame dance erratically, speeding up time. Poor quality wax might melt unevenly, stretching an hour into 2 or cramming 2 into 1. But here's what's fascinating. People didn't discard them over these quirks. They adapted. Some placed candles in lanterns to shield them from wind. Others mixed beeswax with tallow for a steadier burn. Every workaround was a testament to human ingenuity, a refusal to let imperfection stand in the way of progress. What's often overlooked is how candle clocks shaped the very rhythm of daily life. Unlike our modern obsession with precision, these devices introduced a gentle, flexible kind of timekeeping. A melted notch didn't just mark an hour, it marked a moment, the space between supper and sleep, between one prayer and the next. Time wasn't yet a tyrant, it was a companion, its passage softened by the warm glow of a flame. In a world where darkness could feel endless, the candle clock was a promise that every hour, no matter how long or short, would eventually light the way to the next. The deep, resonant toll of a church bell didn't just echo through stone towers, it carved time itself into the collective consciousness of medieval life. Unlike sundials or candle clocks, which served individuals or small groups, bells transformed timekeeping into a shared experience, a rhythm that entire villages and towns moved to. Imagine waking not to an alarm on your phone but to the slow, solemn peals of prime, calling you to morning prayer, or pausing in the fields at the sound of sext, knowing that halfway through the day, your labor was mirrored by neighbors miles away. These weren't just signals, they were the heartbeat of a community, stitching together the fragmented patchwork of daily life into something cohesive. The genius of the bell lay in its universality. Whether you were a blacksmith at the forge, a mother grinding grain, or a merchant haggling in the marketplace, the sound cut through noise and distance, binding everyone to the same moment. Monasteries had long used bells to mark the divine office, those 8 sacred intervals of prayer, but as towns grew, secular authorities adopted the practice too. Bells announced the opening and closing of city gates, the start of markets, even the dreaded curfew, when all fires had to be extinguished for the night. In an age without streetlights or police, that evening bell wasn't just a reminder. It was a lifeline, a collective agreement that darkness meant rest and safety. What's remarkable is how these sounds shaped the very fabric of society. The bells of medieval Europe didn't just tell time, they created it. Workers negotiated wages based on bell hours, not minutes. Contracts specified deadlines by the ringing of none, not a numbered clock face. Even the language of time revolved around sound. People spoke of hearing sext rather than seeing noon. This auditory timekeeping was so ingrained that travelers knew they'd entered a new town when the rhythm of the bells shifted. Each place had its own cadence, like a distinct dialect of time. But the power of the bell went deeper than practicality. It fostered something rare in an era of feudal divisions, a sense of shared existence. When the bell tolled for vespers, rich and poor alike paused, if only for a breath, united by the same call. In emergencies, a fire, an attack, the frantic clanging mobilized everyone, turning scattered individuals into a single force. The bell was the original social network, a technology that didn't just inform but connected, turning isolated routines into a synchronized dance. Yet this system wasn't flawless. Bells required trained ringers and constant maintenance. Weather could muffle their sound, and conflicting signals from rival churches sometimes caused confusion. But these challenges only underscored the bell's importance. When one failed, the disruption rippled through daily life like a skipped heartbeat. The medieval world had stumbled onto a profound truth. Time isn't just measured, it's lived, and nothing brings people together like hearing the same moment at the same time. The bell's legacy isn't just in the iron and rope that made it ring. It's in the way it taught humanity to move as one. Monastic life in the Middle Ages didn't just revolve around prayer, it was built on it, brick by brick, hour by hour. At the heart of this ordered existence lay the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century manuscript that didn't just guide spiritual practice but engineered time itself. Benedict's vision sliced the day into 7 sacred intervals: matins before dawn, lauds at sunrise, prime in the early morning, and so on, each a hinge between heaven and earth. But here's what's extraordinary: this wasn't just a schedule. It was a revolution in human discipline, transforming the abstract flow of time into something measurable, something holy. To keep this celestial rhythm, monks became master timekeepers, turning their monasteries into living laboratories of precision. Picture a dim scriptorium where a water clock's steady drip counts down to vespers, or a courtyard where a sundial's shadow inches toward the next office. At night, when darkness swallowed the sun's cues, they lit notched candles, watching flame and wax conspire to mark the hours. Some monasteries even employed the astrolabe, a sophisticated device borrowed from Islamic scholars, to track celestial movements and fine-tune their prayers to the cosmos itself. This wasn't just routine, it was a kind of timekeeping alchemy, blending faith with innovation. But the genius of monastic timekeeping wasn't confined to abbey walls. As monasteries grew into hubs of trade and education, their rhythmic discipline seeped into the secular world. Merchants adopted the idea of dividing the workday into segments, mirroring the monks' offices. Town councils synchronized meetings with the ringing of monastic bells. Even peasant farmers, whose lives had long been dictated by seasons, began structuring tasks around these audible markers of time. The monastery's rigid schedule became society's metronome, teaching medieval Europe an unprecedented lesson: that time could be harnessed, not just endured. What's often overlooked is how this system balanced rigidity with flexibility. While the rule demanded punctuality, it also acknowledged nature's rhythms, shortening winter prayers when daylight waned, or adjusting meal times with the harvest. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was wisdom. The monks understood that timekeeping served humans, not the other way around. Their legacy isn't just in the water clocks or candle marks they left behind, it's in the very idea that a structured day could be both a spiritual act and a civic gift. Long before factories or offices, these robed horologists laid the groundwork for the modern world's most precious commodity: measured time. The astrolabe wasn't just a tool, it was a medieval smartphone, a pocket-sized universe that could tell time, map the stars, and even calculate the height of a cathedral tower. At first glance, it looked like an intricate metal disc etched with concentric circles and delicate pointers, but in the hands of a skilled user, it became a window into the cosmos. Unlike sundials or candle clocks, which were bound to daylight or flame, the astrolabe worked day and night, rain or shine, by measuring the angles of celestial bodies. Hold it up to the sky, align its pointers with the sun or a bright star like Polaris, and suddenly, the abstract concept of time snapped into focus. What made the astrolabe revolutionary was its adaptability. Scholars like Geoffrey Chaucer, yes, the Canterbury Tales poet, didn't just use it. They wrote step-by-step manuals, turning complex astronomy into something a merchant or student could grasp. Chaucer's treatise on the astrolabe, dedicated to his young son, reads like a medieval for dummies guide, breaking down how to calculate everything from prayer times to the best moments for bloodletting, a common medical practice. This wasn't niche knowledge, it was practical wisdom, blending science, religion, and daily life into a single device. But the astrolabe's brilliance went beyond timekeeping. Sailors used it to navigate treacherous seas, lining up its markings with the horizon and stars to plot courses across uncharted waters. Architects employed it to measure the angles of buildings, ensuring cathedrals soared straight toward heaven. Even farmers consulted it to track seasonal shifts, planting crops when the stars signaled fertile ground. In an era before specialization, the astrolabe was the ultimate multi-tool, proof that medieval minds didn't just passively observe the world but actively decoded it. Yet its greatest legacy might be how it bridged cultures. Originally perfected by Islamic scholars, the astrolabe entered Europe through translation hubs like Toledo, Spain, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thinkers worked side by side. The markings on many surviving astrolabes are bilingual Arabic and Latin, a silent testament to collaboration across faiths and borders. This wasn't just technology transfer, it was the birth of a shared scientific language, one that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. The astrolabe's decline came not from obsolescence but from its own success. As its principles inspired more specialized instruments, quadrants, sextants, mechanical clocks, it faded from daily use. But its spirit endured. In a world where we carry devices that track our steps, guide our drives, and connect us across continents, we're still living in the astrolabe's shadow. It taught humanity a lesson we've never forgotten, that time isn't just something we measure, but something we shape. For the medieval peasant, time wasn't marked by the tick of a clock, but by the turn of the earth, the slow, inevitable shift from frost to thaw, from seed to stalk to harvest. Their lives pulsed with the rhythm of the seasons, a calendar written not in ink but in the sweat of plowed fields and the golden weight of ripe grain. Spring meant bending over freshly turned soil, fingers pressing seeds into the damp earth. Summer brought the back-breaking labor of weeding and tending, while autumn's shortening days demanded frantic reaping before winter's grip locked the land in ice. This wasn't a schedule, it was survival, a dance with nature where missteps meant hunger. Manorial records from the period reveal how deeply this cyclical time rooted itself in daily life. A tenant farmer's obligations weren't counted in hours, but in tasks tied to the land's needs. So many days of plowing the Lord's fields when the soil softened in April, so many bushels of barley owed after the harvest moon. Even the length of a workday flexed with the sun's arc. Laborers rose at first light in summer, but might toil only a few hushed hours during winter's bleak stretch. Time wasn't something to be wasted or saved. It was something to be lived, each season offering its own urgent purpose. What's striking is how this agrarian rhythm created a kind of timekeeping democracy. A wealthy lord might own the land, but not the sun's pace or the rain's arrival. When drought parched the fields or an early frost nipped the vines, everyone, noble and peasant alike, answered to forces beyond human control. This shared vulnerability forged a unique relationship with time, patient when waiting for crops to ripen, frenzied when storms loomed over unharvested wheat. Modern obsessions with punctuality would have baffled medieval farmers. Why watch a water clock when the apple blossoms signaled it was time to plant peas? Yet this seasonal timekeeping wasn't primitive, it was precise in its own way. Folklore and farming manuals abounded with nature's cues. Plant onions when the oak leaves were the size of a mouse's ear, shear sheep when the hawthorn bloomed. These weren't quaint sayings but finely tuned observations passed down through generations. The medieval peasant could read the land like a scholar deciphers a manuscript, interpreting the flight of cranes or the thickness of acorn shells to predict winter's severity. Their almanac was written in the world around them. The tension between rural and urban timekeeping reveals a fascinating cultural divide. While monasteries and merchants were segmenting days into hours, the countryside moved to an older, deeper beat. Market towns might set transactions by the toll of a bell, but farmers still brought goods to sell based on when the barley was ready, not a fixed market day. This clash of temporal worlds occasionally sparked conflict, like when a harvest ran late and hungry cities grumbled over delayed grain shipments. Yet the two systems coexisted, woven together by necessity. The peasants' seasonal labor fed the monks' regimented prayers and the merchants' timed voyages. There's a quiet irony here. Today, we've never been more divorced from agrarian time, yet we still feel its ghost. We speak of seasons of life or reaping what we sow, metaphors that linger like fossils in our language. The medieval peasant would nod knowingly for them. Time wasn't an abstract grid but a living thing, as real as the callus on a plowman's hand or the scent of rain on thirsty soil. Their legacy isn't just in the crops they grew but in the wisdom they embodied, that some rhythms can't be rushed, only respected. The clamor of a medieval marketplace wasn't just haggling and barter, it was the sound of time itself being reshaped to fit the needs of commerce. As towns swelled into bustling hubs of trade, the chaos of unregulated markets became impossible to ignore. Picture a square crammed with merchants from a dozen regions, each operating on their own vague sense of time. A spice seller packing up at midday while a cloth trader argued it was barely morning. Without coordination, disputes flared over missed deals or suspect weights and measures. Something had to give, and so, the birth of market hours became one of medieval Europe's quiet revolutions. Town councils stepped in as timekeepers of commerce, decreeing that stalls could only open and close at specific intervals marked by the tolling of bells. These weren't gentle suggestions but strict ordinances, backed by fines or even banishment for repeat offenders. In places like London or Bruges, officials known as market clerks patrolled with water clocks or sundials, ensuring no one cheated the system by closing early to avoid taxes. The effect was transformative. Suddenly, a wool merchant from Flanders could plan a journey knowing the linen sellers in Champagne would be ready when he arrived. Time became a currency as tangible as silver pennies, but the real genius of this system lay in its ripple effects. Standardized market hours didn't just reduce fistfights over stall spaces, they enabled long-distance trade networks to flourish. German miners could time their ore shipments to match the opening of Venetian markets. Hanseatic League ships synchronized voyages with tidal charts and urban bell schedules. Even contracts evolved, specifying delivery by the third bell of the market day, rather than vague promises like before winter. This precision turned local fairs into nodes in a sprawling economic web, laying the foundation for what we'd now call supply chains. What's often overlooked is how commercial timekeeping borrowed from, and then influenced other systems. Monastic bells had long marked prayer times, but now secular towers rang for profit, not piety. The sundials farmers used to gauge planting seasons were repurposed to time tariff collections. Even candle clocks, once tools of devotion in dim chapels, found new life in guild halls where artisans timed apprentices' work hours. The medieval economy didn't invent time discipline, it hybridized it, stitching together sacred, agrarian, and mechanical methods into something wholly new. The legacy of these market hours echoes in ways we rarely consider. Modern stock exchanges with their opening bells, direct descendants of the medieval crier who signaled trading could begin. The 9-to-5 workday, its roots stretch back to statutes like the 12-hour market day in 14th century Florence. But perhaps the most profound shift was psychological. As commerce synchronized time, people began to see it as a resource to be managed, not just experienced. The peasant's flexible task time gave way to the merchant's rigid clock time, a change that would ultimately tick its way into every facet of life. The marketplace didn't just trade goods, it traded moments, and in doing so reshaped humanity's relationship with time itself. Setting out on a medieval journey was less like checking a train schedule and more like gambling with the sun. Without precise clocks, travelers, whether pilgrims trudging to Canterbury or merchants hauling silks along the Silk Road, faced a world where time was as unpredictable as bandits in a mountain pass. Distances weren't measured in miles but in days, a deceptively simple term that could mean anything from a pleasant stroll to a grueling marathon, depending on the season, the weather, or the whim of a lame pack horse. A summer day's travel might stretch 18 hours under the golden sun, while a winter trek could shrink to a bleak 6-hour window before darkness forced a halt. The real chaos came at day's end. Imagine arriving at an inn just as the innkeeper barred the doors, insisting sunset had passed, even though your own shadow suggested otherwise. With every town operating on its own loose interpretation of solar time, a traveler might gain or lose an hour simply by crossing a hill. Merchants racing to deliver perishable goods like fish or wine faced nightmares of spoiled cargo, while pilgrims missed sacred vespers because their home abbey's bell rang earlier than the local monasteries. Time wasn't just inconsistent, it was a shapeshifter, bending with latitude, terrain, and even local customs. Yet necessity bred ingenuity. Along well-trodden routes like the Via Francigena to Rome, communities hammered itinerary markers into the earth stone pillars carved with symbols indicating half-day or full-day segments to the next town. These weren't mere signposts, they were temporal lifelines allowing travelers to recalibrate expectations. Monastic hostels sprang up at calculated intervals, offering shelter precisely where weary feet would need it. Even road systems evolved, with feudal lords maintaining smoother paths to shave precious hours off journeys, knowing faster travel meant more tolls and trade. The most fascinating adaptations, though, were the human ones. Seasoned travelers learned to read the sky like a clock, using the sun's height to estimate remaining daylight. Caravans employed pace-setters who matched strides to a mental rhythm, ensuring steady progress. Some pilgrims even sang psalms at a measured tempo, a walking metronome that helped track distance. These weren't just tricks, they were survival skills in a world where arriving late could mean sleeping in a ditch or missing a critical market day. What's easy to overlook is how these challenges reshaped society itself. The very concept of a day's journey forced communities to synchronize. Regional fairs aligned their opening dates with predictable travel times from major cities. Royal couriers developed relay systems where fresh horses waited at intervals calibrated to a galloper's endurance. Even the rise of banking owes a debt to medieval time chaos. Letters of credit spared merchants from carrying coin on unpredictable trips. The irony, this messy, sun-drenched system worked. For all its frustrations, it bound the medieval world together with a flexible, living rhythm. Modern GPS might tell us exactly when we'll arrive, but it stripped away the shared struggle and ingenuity of navigating time as a collective adventure. The next time your flight gets delayed, remember, at least you're not arguing with an innkeeper about whether the sun has truly set. Medieval scholars didn't just accept the imperfections of sundials and water clocks, they dissected them, probing the very nature of light and motion to wring more precision from the ancient tools. Among these thinkers, Robert Grosseteste stood out, a 13th century bishop whose writings on optics read like proto-scientific revolution. He theorized that light wasn't just illumination but a measurable force, its angles and reflections holding mathematical secrets that could perfect timekeeping. Picture him in his Oxford study, sketching diagrams of sunbeams striking a sundial's gnomon, calculating how to compensate for seasonal shifts in the sun's arc. His work wasn't abstract musing. It translated into tangible improvements like sundials with curved, adjustable faces that accounted for the sun's changing path across the year. Roger Bacon, Grosseteste's intellectual heir, took this further. A friar with the mind of an engineer, he saw timekeeping as both a scientific challenge and a spiritual imperative. Accurate clocks meant punctual prayers. His experiments with lenses and mirrors sought to amplify sunlight for cloudy day timekeeping, while his notes on mechanical escapements hinted at ideas that would later birth true clocks. These men weren't lone geniuses. They worked within a vibrant academic ecosystem. Universities like Paris and Padua became workshops for horological innovation, where translations of Arabic star charts met Greek geometry, and scholars debated whether time was a divine constant or a variable to be conquered. The tools emerging from these collaborations were marvels of medieval ingenuity. Some sundials now featured compasses for perfect alignment, while others had interchangeable plates for different latitudes, a boon for merchants crossing Europe's varied terrain. Water clocks grew more sophisticated too, with gears borrowed from Arabic designs regulating flow rates to minimize error. Even the humble candle clock got an upgrade. Scholars experimented with wax mixed with chemicals to ensure steadier burning, while markings became precise enough to track quarter hours. What's striking is how these innovations blurred lines between disciplines. Astronomy informed timekeeping. Timekeeping shaped architecture. Cathedral builders used noon marks to align structures, and architecture influenced urban planning. This wasn't just progress, it was a feedback loop of knowledge, each advance pulling society closer to the mechanical clocks that would soon dominate town squares. The medieval pursuit of accuracy didn't just give us better tools. It reshaped how humanity perceived time itself, no longer just a celestial rhythm, but a puzzle waiting to be solved. Deep in the shadowy cloisters of medieval monasteries, a quiet revolution was ticking into existence, not with the polished gears of later centuries, but with ropes, weights, and the relentless pull of gravity. These were the verge escapement mechanisms, the ungainly ancestors of the mechanical clock that would eventually conquer the world. Picture a simple device, a vertical rod with pallets that catch and release a toothed wheel, controlled by the slow descent of a stone weight. Each shuddering tick was crude, inconsistent yet revolutionary. For the first time, humanity had created a timekeeper that didn't rely on the whims of sunlight, the evaporation of water, or the burning of wax. It was a machine, flawed but autonomous, marking time by its own mechanical heartbeat. The irony is rich. These early weight-driven devices emerged from the very places that had perfected spiritual timekeeping, the monasteries. Monks, those meticulous schedulers of prayer, became accidental engineers. Their water clocks and candle marks had served them well, but the divine offices demanded something more reliable. especially during long winter nights when water froze and candles guttered. The verge escapement, though it might lose or gain an hour in a day, was a revelation. It didn't need refilling or relighting. It just needed a weight to drop over and over, turning potential energy into measured motion. What's often overlooked is how these clunky prototypes reflected a seismic shift in thinking. Earlier timekeeping had been about observing, tracking the sun's arc or the moon's phases. The verge escapement was about imposing. Here was a human-made system, dictating time's passage rather than submitting to it. Monasteries didn't just adopt these devices, they became laboratories for tinkering. Blacksmiths forged better gears, scholars debated escapement angles. Each improvement, however slight, nudged society closer to a radical idea. That time could be standardized, divorced from nature's irregularities. The cultural ripple effects were profound. As these mechanisms spread from cloisters to town squares, they carried with them a new discipline. Artisans began dividing work into shifts timed by the tower clock's chimes. Merchants synchronized shipments to the rhythm of gears rather than the sun's position. Even the language of time changed. People spoke of clock hours rather than canonical hours, a subtle but telling shift from sacred to secular control. Yet for all their innovation, these early devices were notoriously finicky. A change in temperature could warp their wooden gears, dust clogged their mechanisms. The weights, if not perfectly calibrated, might race toward the ground or stall mid-descent, but their imperfections were just as instructive as their successes. Every flaw exposed a new problem to solve, a puzzle that would occupy generations of inventors. The verge escapement didn't just tell time, it taught humanity how to think in mechanical terms, laying the intellectual foundation for everything from looms to locomotives. In hindsight, these monastery-born machines were more than prototypes. They were philosophical statements. Their steady, if imperfect, ticks whispered a daring proposition. That time wasn't a force to be observed, but a resource to be managed. That idea would eventually fuel factories, railroads, and the modern world's relentless pace. But its origins were humble, a creaking weight in a dim stone corridor, marking the moments between one prayer and the next. While medieval Europe measured time with candles and church bells, the Islamic world was engineering marvels that would redefine precision. In bustling cities like Baghdad and Damascus, scholars weren't just observing time, they were dissecting it, refining it, and bending it to human will. Take Al-Jazari, the polymath whose 12th century book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices reads like a medieval tech manifesto. His elephant clock wasn't just a timekeeper. It was a spectacle, a towering brass automaton with a mahout striking a cymbal every half hour, while serpents coiled and dropped balls into bowls below. Powered by a water tank hidden in the elephant's belly, this masterpiece didn't just tell time, it performed it, blending art, engineering, and astronomy into a single kinetic symphony. But the real breakthroughs lay in the astrolabes' evolution. Islamic scholars didn't just adopt this ancient tool, they revolutionized it, adding gears, adjustable plates, and intricate star maps that could calculate prayer times across latitudes with jaw-dropping accuracy. In the hands of a 10th century astronomer like al-Biruni, the astrolabe became a portable observatory, capable of predicting eclipses or aligning a mosque's Qibla wall toward Mecca. These weren't just gadgets for elites, they were practical tools. Traveling merchants used pocket-sized versions to navigate deserts, while farmers consulted them to schedule irrigation, proof that precision timekeeping could thrive outside monastery walls. The heartbeat of Islamic timekeeping, though, pulsed in the mosques. Unlike Europe's flexible canonical hours, Muslim prayer times were tied to celestial events: Fajr at dawn, Dhuhr when the sun passed its zenith. This demanded unprecedented accuracy. mosque timekeepers called muwakkits tracked shadows on intricately carved sundials or calibrated water clocks with floats that triggered prayer calls. In Cairo's grand mosques, they even used magnetic compasses to correct for sundial errors, a fusion of technology and faith that would have made Roger Bacon envious. What's often forgotten is how these innovations crossed borders. When Christian kings like Alfonso X of Castile wanted to upgrade their timekeeping, they commissioned translations of Arabic manuals. The gears in European tower clocks, their lineage traces back to designs in Al-Jazari's manuscripts, transmitted through trade routes and scholarly exchanges. Even the word clock itself may derive from the Arabic sa', a reminder that progress often wears many cultural fingerprints. The Islamic world's greatest contribution wasn't just better devices, it was a new mindset. Time wasn't merely observed, it was calculated, predicted, and engineered. While Europeans were still dividing days into vague liturgical hours, Persian astronomers were debating the merits of decimal timekeeping. This intellectual ferment laid groundwork far beyond horology. It taught humanity that precision wasn't just possible, it was necessary. The ticking gears of future centuries owed their rhythm to these medieval innovators who saw time not as a mystery, but as an equation waiting to be solved. Festivals in the Middle Ages didn't just mark time, they embodied it, turning abstract cycles into shared celebrations that pulsed through entire communities. Picture May Day, when villages erupted in dances around flower-covered poles, or the midwinter revelry of Christmas, stretching 12 days to match the slow turn toward longer sunlight. These weren't arbitrary dates on a calendar, but anchors in the year's rhythm, synchronized with the solstices, harvests, and holy days that governed medieval life. Unlike our modern obsession with counting down minutes, these festivals reveled in repetition, teaching each generation that time wasn't a straight line but a wheel, always bringing back the blossoms, the feasts, the frosts in their season. The magic of these celebrations lay in their duality. They honored both the sacred and the practical, the Virgin Mary's Assumption in August coinciding with the first wheat harvest, or St. John's Eve in June aligning with bonfires to ward off pests from ripening crops. Even the most solemn religious events, like Lent's 40 days of fasting, were bookended by Carnival's raucous indulgence, a reminder that scarcity and abundance were two sides of time's coin. Farmers didn't need pocket watches to know when to prune vines or shear sheep. They simply recalled that the task came 3 weeks after Whitsun or a fortnight before Michaelmas. The festival calendar was a living almanac, its dates etched not in ink but in muscle memory and communal tradition. What's often overlooked is how these rituals forged collective identity. When a town gathered to watch mystery plays recounting biblical stories during Corpus Christi, or when young men raced to retrieve a greased goose during Shrovetide, they weren't just passing hours, they were synchronizing their inner clocks. The laughter, the processions, even the drunken brawls became temporal landmarks as reliable as any sundial. A medieval peasant might forget the day of the month, but they'd never mistake the scent of roasting chestnuts in November or the sound of carols echoing through snow-cloaked streets. Time wasn't something to be measured in isolation. It was woven into the smells, tastes, and sounds of shared experience. Yet these festivals did more than mark moments, they shaped memory itself. In a world without photographs or journals, the cyclical return of events became a way to mark personal milestones. A mother might recall that her son took his first steps during the midsummer bonfire, or a widow remember her husband's death by the Lenten fast that followed. This cyclical timekeeping created a peculiar kind of immortality. As long as the festivals repeated, so too did the stories attached to them. The past wasn't a foreign country, it was a familiar guest returning each year with the same songs, the same flavors, the same firelight flickering on familiar faces. The contrast to our modern linear time couldn't be starker. Today, we chase novelty, New Year's resolutions, bucket lists, countdowns to personal deadlines. But the medieval world found comfort in the expected, the reliable return of the same joys and sorrows, each tied to its season. There's a quiet wisdom in that rhythm, a reminder that some things, the blush of spring, the ache of winter, the need to come together and rejoice, transcend centuries. The festivals may have faded, but their legacy lingers in our longing for connection, for markers that tell us not just what time it is, but who we are. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't just about laws and verdicts, it was about time. Picture a courtroom where a merchant's fate hinged on whether he delivered wool by the agreed hour, or a labor dispute where wages rested on how long a servant had worked. Without precise clocks, how did courts enforce fairness? They turned to the steady drip of water clocks or the slow burn of marked candles, transforming these humble tools into instruments of legal precision. In places like Venice or London, where trade disputes could involve fortunes, a water clock's measured flow might decide whose testimony ran too long or whether a contract's deadline had truly passed. The stakes were high. A delayed shipment of Flemish cloth could bankrupt a trader. A disputed workday might mean starvation for a laborer's family. To prevent chaos, courts developed strict protocols. Some water clocks had floating markers that triggered a bell when time expired, like a medieval version of today's courtroom timers. In Frankfurt, candle clocks were used to limit witness speeches, with notches corresponding to specific legal procedures. Once the flame reached a certain mark, the testimony ended, no matter how dramatic the revelation. This wasn't just efficiency, it was a radical idea that justice required impartial timekeeping, free from human whim. But the real innovation came from pressure. As commerce boomed, so did lawsuits, pushing courts to refine their methods. In Genoa, officials calibrated water clocks against sundials to minimize errors. English guilds kept time candles under lock and key to prevent tampering. Even church courts, which handled everything from marital disputes to heresy trials, adopted candle clocks to ensure equitable hearings. The message was clear. In a world where seconds could sway verdicts, timekeeping wasn't just useful, it was morally necessary. What's fascinating is how these legal needs spilled into daily life. The same candle marks used in courtrooms began appearing in labor contracts, with phrases like, "from the lighting of the first notch until the third." Market regulators borrowed water clock designs to time auction bids. Over time, the precision demanded by courts became the standard for entire cities, weaving temporal discipline into the fabric of society. The courtroom's obsession with fairness didn't just shape laws, it reshaped humanity's relationship with time itself, proving that even in an age without gears, justice couldn't wait. Out on the open ocean, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, medieval sailors faced a challenge land dwellers could scarcely imagine: tracking time without towers, without church bells, without even the steady drip of a water clock. Their solution was as simple as it was ingenious: the hourglass, a device where each grain of falling sand marked the relentless passage of moments. Unlike sundials rendered useless by cloud or night, these glass-bound timekeepers worked in any weather, their measured trickle dividing the ship's day into disciplined watches. A sailor might flip the glass the moment the last grain fell, calling out as the watch changed, ensuring someone always manned the sails, always scanned for storms or pirates. But the hourglass was only part of the story. On clear nights, navigators turned their gaze upward, reading time in the slow wheeling of stars across the heavens. The North Star, fixed like a celestial pivot, became their anchor point, while other constellations, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, acted as cosmic clock hands, their positions revealing how many hours had passed since dusk. Arab and Mediterranean sailors carried portable astrolabes, aligning them with Polaris to calculate not just direction but elapsed time, blending astronomy with horology in ways that would make even monastery scholars envious. These methods were far from perfect. A rough sea could tilt an hourglass, speeding or slowing its flow. Clouds might veil the stars for nights on end, leaving crews to estimate time by sheer instinct. Yet the very imperfection of these tools forced sailors to develop an almost supernatural sense of rhythm. Veteran captains could feel the length of a watch in their bones, their internal clocks honed by years of salt and spray. Logbooks from the period reveal how crews compensated for errors, comparing sandglass flips with the sun's zenith at noon, or cross-referencing stellar observations with lunar phases. What's extraordinary is how these rudimentary techniques enabled voyages that reshaped the world. The Hanseatic League's ships, laden with Baltic grain and Flemish wool, relied on sandglasses to coordinate convoys across the North Sea. Portuguese explorers venturing down Africa's coast timed their turns with hourglasses calibrated to the Southern Cross. Even Columbus, though often mythologized as a lone genius, depended on these communal timekeeping traditions, his crew marking shifts with a shared sandglass, their survival hinging on its gritty, inexorable flow. The legacy of maritime timekeeping lingers in phrases we still use today. The graveyard watch for the bleak pre-dawn hours, turning the glass as a metaphor for urgency. These weren't just tools, they were rituals binding crews together in a shared dance against the vast, timeless sea. And while modern GPS has replaced the stars and atomic clocks have outpaced the sand's fall, the sailors' struggle to tame time remains one of history's quietest revolutions, a testament to human ingenuity adrift on the endless blue. The Black Death didn't just steal lives, it shattered time itself. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, killing nearly half the population in some regions, the rhythms that had structured medieval life collapsed like a water clock with its basin cracked open. Fields lay untended because there were no hands to sow them. Church bells tolled endlessly for the dead rather than marking canonical hours. Markets stood empty, their usual opening bells silenced by the absence of both merchants and customers. In this chaos, the very concept of time warped. Days blurred into nights as survivors cared for the dying, and seasons lost their meaning when harvests rotted on the stalk. The meticulous monastic schedules that had once ordered society now seemed almost laughable in the face of such devastation. Yet from this disruption emerged something unexpected, a new urgency around time's value. With so many laborers dead, those who remained found their work suddenly in demand, and their hours more precious. Peasants who had once toiled from dawn to dusk under feudal obligations now bargained for shorter days and higher wages, their labor scarce enough to rewrite the rules. In England, the Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried desperately to freeze wages and hours at pre-plague levels, but the genie was out of the bottle. Time had become a commodity, its worth measured in silver rather than shadows. The plague also reshaped time's spiritual dimension. Processions of flagellants marched from town to town, their self-mortification timed to chants and drumbeats, as if punishing their bodies could turn back death's hourglass. Churches introduced new feast days to appease divine wrath, scrambling the liturgical calendar. Some monasteries, their ranks decimated, abandoned the strict divine office altogether, merging prayers into clustered sessions. The orderly progression of sacred hours, once the backbone of medieval timekeeping, now bent under the weight of collective grief. But amid the rubble of old systems, seeds of innovation took root. The labor shortages that followed the plague created a surge in artisanal trades, including clockmaking. As skilled workers commanded higher wages, more people could afford personal timekeeping devices like portable sundials or tabletop hourglasses. The wealthy, confronted with mortality's randomness, grew obsessed with measuring their remaining days. By the 15th century, this desperation for control would fuel the rise of domestic clocks, not just as tools, but as talismans against time's cruelty. The Black Death's greatest lesson was this: time wasn't just a rhythm to follow, but a resource to seize. In its aftermath, the slow, seasonal patience of the medieval world gave way to something sharper, more urgent. The plague hadn't just killed people, it had killed complacency, leaving behind a society that would soon demand clocks not merely to mark hours, but to master them. Guild halls across medieval Europe didn't just produce goods, they produced time itself, meticulously shaping the rhythms of labor to balance quality with fairness. Picture a blacksmith's workshop in 14th century Florence, where the day began not when the master felt like it, but when the guild's bell echoed across the square, signaling the first shift. These weren't suggestions, they were laws, etched into guild statutes with fines for those who dared work too early or too late. The reason? Excessive hours meant shoddy craftsmanship, tired hands made weak swords or uneven textiles, while too few threatened the guild's reputation. Time became the invisible thread stitching together quality, fairness, and community trust. But guild timekeeping wasn't just about the clock. Apprenticeships stretched 7 years or more, a duration measured not in hours but in seasons of growth. A young weaver didn't simply log shifts at the loom. He absorbed techniques through winters of dye mixing and summers of pattern setting, his progress marked by the gradual complexity of his tasks rather than a time card. This long-term perspective reflected a profound truth: mastery couldn't be rushed. Guilds understood that skill seeped into fingers and mind through repetition and patience, a stark contrast to today's crash courses and weekend certifications. The guild system's genius lay in its flexibility within structure. While bells regulated collective work hours, individual craftsmen could adapt their pace. A glassblower might pause mid-afternoon to let a piece cool, while a scribe worked late by candlelight to meet a patron's deadline. Guilds even accounted for seasonal shifts. Shorter winter days might mean fewer official work hours, but spring's longer light allowed for extra production. This wasn't chaos, it was a dance between communal discipline and artisan autonomy, ensuring both quality control and creative freedom. What's often overlooked is how these timekeeping practices fostered equality. Wealthy masters and humble journeymen labored the same hours under the same bell. Apprentices, though at the bottom of the hierarchy, knew exactly when their training would end, unlike feudal serfs bound to endless, unmarked toil. The guild clock, whether literal or metaphorical, offered something revolutionary: predictability. A carpenter could plan his life around the certainty of a 7-year apprenticeship, just as a clothier knew market days would always open at the third bell. The legacy of guild timekeeping lingers in surprising places. Modern unions' 8-hour workday debates echo guilds' insistence on balanced labor. The concept of a masterpiece, originally a timed test of skill required for guild promotion, still shapes how we certify expertise. Even our cultural obsession with 10,000 hours to master a skill owes a debt to those medieval workshops where time wasn't just spent, but invested. The guilds didn't just make goods, they made a philosophy that time, when carefully measured and respected, could forge both exceptional craftsmanship and a fairer society. While monks measured prayers and merchants tracked market hours, medieval women orchestrated time on an entirely different scale, not in towers or trade halls, but in the quiet hum of hearth and home. Domestic timekeeping was an unspoken art, one that balanced the immediacy of hungry children with the slow rhythms of fermenting ale or flax soaking in troughs. A housewife might mark the morning by the angle of sunlight slanting across her butter churn, or gauge the afternoon's passage by how many candle notches burned while she spun wool into thread. These women didn't need town criers or water clocks. Their timepieces were the rising bread dough, the fading heat of the oven stones, the precise moment when honey turned golden in the boiling pot. Consider the sheer complexity of their temporal calculus. Meal preparation alone required layering tasks like a symphony, starting the stew when the sundial's shadow touched the herb garden, kneading dough during the lull between milking and mending, timing the roast to coincide with her husband's return from the fields. Textile work, often dismissed as mere women's labor, demanded exquisite timing. Flax retted too long became brittle. Wool dyed during a waxing moon, as some traditions held, absorbed color more vividly. Even child rearing followed its own clock, with lullabies timed to the flicker of a bedside candle and weaning schedules set by the harvest moon's phases. Yet what's truly remarkable is how these domestic timekeepers bridged natural and mechanical methods. Some households kept scratch calendars. On door frames, tally marks tracking menstrual cycles or the days until a sow farrowed. Wealthier women might own a brass shepherd's dial, a pocket sundial used to coordinate servants' chores, and in convents, abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen adapted monastic time discipline to women's work, aligning prayer with the pauses between brewing and cheese-making. The seasonal dance of preservation reveals another layer of this expertise. Autumn wasn't just a season, it was a race against decay, with women calculating exactly when to pickle cucumbers before they softened or dry herbs before the first frost. In Scandinavia, fermented fish needed weeks of precise temperature checks. In Mediterranean vineyards, grapes had to be pressed at the peak of sweetness, judgments made not by clocks but by generations of accumulated wisdom. This wasn't haphazard guesswork, it was a science of observation where a grandmother's note that elderflowers bloom when the pork should be smoked carried the weight of an almanac. Historical records largely ignore these achievements, scribbling more about kings' decrees than kitchen chronometers. But archaeology whispers what parchments omit. The notched bones found in cottage ruins, likely used to tally menstrual cycles or planting days. The charred candle stubs with wax layers revealing measured burn rates. Even fairy tales hint at this hidden temporality. Think of Cinderella's pumpkin coach dissolving at midnight, a metaphor for the relentless domestic deadlines women faced. The legacy of medieval women's timekeeping survives in phrases we still use: putting things by for preservation, making time for sewing. Their invisible clocks didn't just structure daily life, they sustained civilizations, turning raw ingredients into nourishment, chaos into order, one sun-marked or candle-measured moment at a time. While tower clocks later claimed the spotlight, it was the quiet, relentless tempo of women's work that first taught time to bend to human need. Medieval calendars were far more than just grids of days. They were living tapestries woven from celestial cycles, church doctrine, and the stubborn persistence of ancient traditions. The Julian calendar, introduced by Caesar in 45 BC, still governed official timekeeping, but its creeping misalignment with solar reality meant that by the 14th century, spring arrived 10 days late on parchment compared to the green shoots in the fields. Yet this discrepancy barely troubled most people, for their lives weren't dictated by abstract dates but by the visceral turning of seasons and saints. In Burgundy, farmers might plant barley not on the 15th of March, but when the first crocus pierced the frost, while in Sweden, fishermen timed their herring runs by the Old Norse festival of Disseblot, quietly preserved under a veneer of Christian feast days. The real magic lay in these regional adaptations. A Breton peasant's almanac could list the feast of Saint Bridget alongside notes on when to bleed livestock, a practice rooted in pre-Christian imbolc. Monastic chroniclers might dutifully record dates in Latin numerals, but marginal sketches of blooming hawthorn or migrating geese betrayed their reliance on nature's cues. Even the Church, for all its universalizing power, tolerated local quirks. In Spain, Mozarabic calendars retained Islamic lunar influences, while Sicily's timekeeping bore traces of Byzantine and Arab rule. This wasn't inconsistency, it was pragmatism, a recognition that time must bend to the land and its labors. Some of the most fascinating hybrids emerged at the edges of Christendom. In Ireland, the Celtic Coligny calendar's intricate bronze plates, once used to track lunar months, found new life as farmers cross-referenced them with Christian fast days. German woodcuts depicted the labors of the months, with zodiac signs cheek by jowl with Saint Taurus, the bull ploughing fields under the watchful gaze of Saint George. These juxtapositions reveal a medieval mindset that saw no contradiction between sacred and cosmic time, only layers of meaning to be navigated like a well-worn path through familiar woods. The disconnect between official and lived time occasionally sparked chaos. Tax collectors demanding payments on fixed Julian dates faced fury from villagers whose harvests were delayed by unseasonal rains. Courts grappled with contracts specifying delivery by Michaelmas, while merchants argued whether that meant September 29th or the first frost. Yet this fluidity also fostered resilience. When the Black Death disrupted labor cycles, communities fell back on phenological markers, planting when the oak leaves unfurled to the size of a mouse's ear, regardless of what scribes claimed the calendar said. Pope Gregory's later reform would impose mathematical order, but medieval calendars remind us of something profound. Timekeeping isn't just about accuracy, it's about meaning. The scribe who doodled a dancing bear in the margin of a liturgical calendar wasn't defacing it. He was anchoring eternity to the earthy, everyday rhythms that made time feel alive. A medieval painter's brush didn't just capture saints and battles, it froze time itself in vivid, haunting symbols. Take the Wheel of Fortune, a favorite motif in illuminated manuscripts, where kings rise and tumble at the whim of a spinning disc. This wasn't mere decoration, it was a philosophical statement in pigment and gold leaf. With each rotation, the wheel whispered that time was no steady march but a capricious dance of ascent and ruin. Artists depicted emperors clutching the wheel's zenith one moment, only to be crushed beneath it the next, a visual sermon on life's transience, meant to jolt viewers from complacency. Equally potent was the Danse Macabre, the dance of death, which slithered across church walls and prayer books alike. Here, skeletons waltzed with popes and peasants, their bony fingers tugging all toward the same inevitable end. What made these scenes revolutionary wasn't their morbidity but their democracy. Death's hour struck equally for the laborer mid-swing of his scythe and the bishop mid-sermon, a stark reminder that time's passage spared no rank. These artworks functioned as medieval memento mori, turning castles and cathedrals into galleries where every mural and stained glass window whispered, "Tempus fugit, time flies." Yet as the Middle Ages waned, a new symbol emerged, the clock face, creeping into the margins of manuscripts and altarpieces. At first glance, these seemed purely functional, a nod to the era's growing mechanical prowess. But look closer. In a 15th century Book of Hours, the Virgin Mary might cradle Christ against a backdrop of a golden clock, its hands fixed at the hour of prayer. The message was subtle but profound. Divine order now had a dial. Unlike the chaotic wheel of fortune, these clocks represented time as measurable, governed, a celestial mechanism ticking in harmony with God's will. The contrast between these symbols reveals a cultural shift. Early medieval art treated time as a force beyond human control, something to be endured or mourned. But by the late Middle Ages, the clock's geometric perfection in art mirrored society's dawning belief that time could be mastered, or at least harnessed. Even the zodiac man, a common illustration showing astrological signs governing body parts, began appearing with clockwork precision, as if the human form itself answered to cosmic gears. What's easily missed is how these artistic choices shaped everyday perception. A peasant gazing at a dance of death fresco internalized time's fleeting nature, while a merchant studying a clock-faced altarpiece absorbed the value of punctuality. Art didn't just reflect changing attitudes, it conditioned them, training medieval minds to see time as both a mortal burden and a divine equation. The brushstrokes of nameless artists quietly paved the way for a world where time wouldn't just be felt, it would be reckoned with. While Europe relied on sundials and candle clocks, medieval China was perfecting water clocks so precise they could track time down to the minute, centuries before mechanical escapements reached the West. The most spectacular of these was the astronomical clock tower designed by Su Song in the 11th century, a towering masterpiece of gears and hydraulics that not only told time but mapped celestial movements with breathtaking accuracy. Powered by a constant flow water wheel and adorned with rotating armillary spheres, it was more than a timekeeper. It was a cosmic symphony in brass and timber, its chimes resonating through the imperial court like the heartbeat of the universe itself. Japan, meanwhile, crafted timekeeping into an art form with the incense clock, a delicate system where different scented powders burned at measured rates, marking hours through fragrance as much as flame. Picture a noblewoman's chamber where sandalwood signaled midday, while a losewood's earthy aroma meant evening approached. These weren't just tools, they were multisensory experiences, blending practicality with poetry. Temples refined the method further, using slow-burning incense coils to time lengthy meditation sessions, each fragrant spiral a silent guide to enlightenment. What's often overlooked is how these innovations traveled. Along the Silk Road, Arab merchants carried Chinese water clock designs to Baghdad, where scholars adapted them into ornate palace timepieces. Persian astronomers, in turn, merged these concepts with Greek sundial theory, creating hybrid instruments that later circled back to Europe through Moorish Spain. The incense clock's influence even reached monastic kitchens. Some historians speculate that European candle clocks may have been inspired by tales of Eastern incense timing, traded alongside spices and silks. The interconnectedness went deeper than mechanics. Chinese star charts, calibrated by water clock observations, helped Islamic astronomers refine celestial navigation. Japanese incense clocks, traded through Korean diplomats, influenced timekeeping rituals in Southeast Asian courts. This wasn't just technology transfer, it was a dialogue, with each culture adapting timekeeping to its own philosophical rhythms. Where Europe segmented time into canonical hours, China's systems mirrored the Taoist flow of yin and yang, while Japan's incense clocks reflected Zen Buddhism's emphasis on impermanence. The most striking legacy lies in the shared challenges. From Kyoto's temples to Paris's cathedrals, societies wrestled with the same paradox: how to impose order on time without losing its organic essence. Whether through the incense coil's fragrant ash or the water clock's steady drip, humanity's quest to measure the immeasurable revealed a universal truth: that timekeeping wasn't just about gears or burning rates, but about finding harmony between human ambition and the timeless pulse of the cosmos. The mechanical clocks that eventually dominated city squares didn't erase medieval timekeeping, they absorbed its wisdom, transforming ancient rhythms into the precise ticks that govern our lives today. Consider the modern workday. Its 8-hour structure isn't some industrial age invention, but a refinement of the guild's balanced labor divisions, where artisans split their time between craft, rest, and prayer. Even the concept of a rush hour echoes medieval market bells herding merchants to stalls at set intervals. The scaffolding of our schedules, lunch breaks, shift rotations, weekend respites, all trace back to monasteries dividing the day into sacred offices or peasants aligning toil with sunlight's ebb and flow. Time zones, often credited to 19th century railroads, owe an unspoken debt to medieval merchants wrestling with longitude. Before standardized hours, trading hubs like Genoa and Bruges adjusted their market clocks to match daylight patterns, creating de facto local time zones. Sailors navigating by stellar clocks already grasped the principle. Time shifted with geography. The irony is rich. Today's globalized world, synchronized by atomic clocks, still orbits around adaptations first forged by traders haggling over wool prices or monks calculating prayer times across distant abbeys. Daylight saving time, that biannual clock-shifting ritual, feels distinctly modern, yet it's rooted in medieval pragmatism. Farmers waking at dawn regardless of clock hands followed the very logic Franklin later championed: maximized daylight. Medieval smiths firing forges at first light weren't saving time, they were bending tools to serve human need, just as we do when we nudge our clocks forward. The deeper legacy lies in this flexibility, the recognition that timekeeping should adapt to life, not the reverse. Perhaps the most profound medieval inheritance is psychological, the notion that time is communal. Mechanical clocks didn't invent punctuality, they democratized what bells and candle marks had long taught. That shared time fosters collective achievement. From guilds coordinating craft timelines to villages synchronizing harvests, medieval society thrived on temporal collaboration. Today's project management software and global supply chains are just silicon and satellite echoes of that same impulse to weave individual effort into a synchronized whole. The pendulum swing between rigidity and flexibility still defines our relationship with time. Medieval peasants accepted nature's unpredictability, but also embraced monastic discipline. We juggle similar tensions, balancing digital calendars with mindfulness retreats, atomic precision with circadian rhythms. The medieval world reminds us that timekeeping isn't about control but harmony, a lesson we're relearning as we question the tyranny of the clock and rediscover the value of natural rhythms. Their legacy isn't in the gears we inherited, but in the enduring truth that how we measure time shapes how we live. From sundials casting their ancient shadows to the steady drip of water clocks and the fragrant burn of incense coils, medieval timekeeping was never just about counting hours. It was about weaving human ingenuity into the very fabric of existence. These weren't crude attempts at precision. They were acts of reverence, aligning the chaos of daily life with the rhythms of the cosmos, the dictates of faith, and the demands of commerce. Picture a world where time wasn't stripped of its texture, reduced to digits on a screen, but lived in the scent of wax melting, the sound of a bell tolling across fields, or the slow turn of stars above a monastery roof. This was timekeeping as an art form, a collaboration between earth and sky, between the hands that carved sundials and the voices that called prayers at matins. The true brilliance of these methods lay in their adaptability. A farmer might plant by the sun but sell at the market bell, while a monk could chant by the candle's notch yet chart the stars with an astrolabe. This flexibility wasn't inconsistency, it was wisdom, a recognition that time served many masters: the harvest, the soul, the ledger book, and from this dance of compromises emerged something revolutionary. The water clocks of Baghdad inspired the gearworks of Europe's cathedral towers. The candle marks of peasants found echoes in the hourglasses of sailors crossing uncharted seas. Even the astrolabe, once a scholar's tool, became the compass for merchants and explorers stitching continents together. What's easily forgotten is how these innovations shaped more than schedules, they reshaped minds. The medieval world didn't just invent new ways to measure time. It taught humanity to see time as something that could be segmented, traded, and mastered. The guilds' regulated work hours planted the seed for labor rights. The monastery's bells became the heartbeat of civic order, and the marketplace's insistence on punctuality laid the groundwork for contracts, currencies, and the trust that fuels global trade today. Every time you glance at a clock or set an alarm, you're tapping into a legacy crafted by countless hands across centuries, each adding their stitch to the tapestry. So the next time you check your phone for the hour, pause for a heartbeat. Behind that instant precision lies a lineage of flame and shadow, of dripping water and turning gears, of scholars squinting at stars and sailors counting sands. Our modern world didn't spring from nowhere. It was built on the patience and ingenuity of those who first dared to pin the fleeting moment to a sundial's edge or a candle's glow. And if you could step back into their world, which tool would you choose? The simplicity of a sundial grounding you in the sun's arc. The portability of an hourglass, its grains a silent reminder of life's flow. Or perhaps the astrolabe, a pocket universe of celestial math. Let us know in the comments. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the hours of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we keep unraveling the threads of the past, one story at a time.